And now a recording is in progress, as the nice computer lady just told me. Join me as we say a bracha for study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are studying Pirkei Avot chapter 3, and we're going to pick up with Mishnah number, hang on, I think it's Mishnah number 12 or 13. So I'll bring it up on screen so that we can look at it together. Again, the main subject of our study this morning will be fences and examining the old saw, good fences make good neighbors. Or do they? That's how I'd like to set us off. So one moment, please. My share screen now will allow us to look at this together. So we have here just a quick reminder. I believe that we touched briefly on Mishnah number 12 last time we were together in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, but I'll just quickly review it because we didn't spend a whole lot of time on it last week. Rabbi Ishmael Omer, Rabbi Ishmael said, I'm over here, be suppliant, right? That was a word that I had to look up, which means place yourself as the subordinate to a superior. Be submissive, where the word for submissive is actually this word here, Noach, like the name Noah, which means comfortable. Under compulsory service, tishchoret. Now that might mean corvée, forced labor, or it might refer to a military draft, or it might simply refer to something else that we don't quite know. It's a strange word that doesn't really come up often, and therefore if you don't have a good context, it's hard to know exactly what the word meant in its context at the time. Ve'mekabel et kol adam b'simcha, and greet every person happily. So a kind of a classic threefold adage that would fit in well with the pattern of many of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. And I think that it helps reinforce for us our understanding of the original context of Pirkei Avot, which is this is, of course, a manual for training up young bochers, young yeshiva students to become rabbanim, to become the master teachers of the Jewish tradition. And that knowing your place in the hierarchy of that society, and not just Jewish society, but specifically the mini society of the academy of the yeshiva, is probably what is meant or what is intended to be the force of Mishnah number 12. But I don't think it requires a whole lot of unpacking. It's one of the very most straightforward of the texts in all of Pirkei Avot. So I'd like us to move on to 13, and now that I'm actually saying we did cover it at the end. So we're now going to hear at some length from Rabbi Akiva, who is without a doubt the most renowned of the Mishnaic Sages. Remember, the Mishnah represents 5 so-called dorot, or generations, of rabbinic teachers who are both original in their framing of new Jewish teaching, as well as great compilers of an extensive corpus of proto-rabbinic teaching. So, for instance, I am cautious about identifying Hillel and Shammai as rabbis because even though they seem to function in the same mode as the other master teachers in the Mishnah who are identified as rabbis, technically speaking, Hillel and Shammai are not rabbis, nor are they referred to in the text as rabbis. They are just given the names Hillel and Shammai, and that seems to be because they were actively teaching, or their academies were active in the century or so before the Common Era, that is to say, before the year 0, what our Christian friends call BC, what we call BCE. And at that time, the tradition does not assign the title rabbi to any of the master teachers. It seems only around actually the time of Jesus does the word rabbi come into common usage. And as I've noted a few times before, in the Christian scripture, Jesus himself is identified as rabbi by his disciples, and the term is used as an honorific. It means teacher. So it's not that Hillel and Shammai did not function in the same way as rabbis, it's just that they're not given the title. Once you get to the Mishnaic period itself, let's say approximately the year 40, so immediately post Jesus, to about the year 230 or so, you have an identified 5 generations of teachers. Though that's probably loose, and generation is not easily defined in terms of an actual span of years. So there are many, many, many rabbis who are recorded in the Mishnah, and I would say Akiva probably excels them all in terms of renown and the impact of his teachings on the emerging Jewish tradition. Some would argue that Akiva is probably top 5 rabbis of all time. He also is a noted political figure in that he becomes the chief backer, or the chief public figure who publicly backs Bar Kokhba in the failed rebellion against Rome in the 130s of the Common Era. And because of that, and also because of his commitment to the public teaching of Torah and the training up of rabbis, he is seized by the Roman authorities and becomes one of the 10 martyrs who was publicly tortured and murdered, as was the Roman way. And the names of those martyrs are recorded in the martyrology service for Yom Kippur afternoon, known as Eila Ezkara, which is Hebrew for "These do I remember." So Eila Ezkara is a medieval piyut, or liturgical poem, specifically used in the Yom Kippur afternoon liturgy, that recalls the 10 martyrs who were tortured and killed by Rome. Some graphic details are recorded about these martyrs, and Akiva in particular is the one about whom it is mentioned that he had his skin flayed with metal combs before being executed, I believe by burning, by being burned alive. But before all that, Akiva had some things to say about merriment and frivolity, which probably would have been subjects far from his mind at the very end of his life. So Rabbi Akiva Omer, we're reading in the Hebrew at the top of the screen. Sechok v'kalut rosh. Some great words here. Sechok is from the Hebrew word for play. So to play a game is actually lisachek, where this is a sin. It's like the letter shin, except the vocal point is moved from the right to the left, so it takes on the S sound, like snake. Sechok means to play, but it is often a double entendre in and of itself. So yes, little children can play games with the same root, sin, chet, kuf. All Hebrew words, not all, but 98% of all Hebrew words derive from a 3-letter shoresh, or root. So this root does mean play in the most innocent sense of the term play, but it also denotes sexual play. Sechok can also mean, we have the word foreplay. Kind of adult play as well. And kalut rosh is a great phrase that means exactly what it says. We spent a lot of time last week on the word kal, which means light, easy. And in this case, kalut rosh, you put it together with the word that means head, and you get lightheadedness. But they're not talking about a condition of having had too much of any kind of intoxicant. Lightheadedness more in the sense of lightheartedness, or even what they say here is frivolity. I would use the word levity, just because I would love to capture the nuance of the light in the sense of not heavy. So kalut rosh literally means light of head, but not taking things seriously. But there's a whole, again, there's a sexual overtone here, which is implicit in the first three words and is made explicit in the next two words. Margilin le'erva. They accustom a person. Margilin from the Hebrew word ragil. You can see the inner letters, which is usually where the root is hiding. Not always, but usually, are resh, gimel, and lamed. Yuds and mems, and these are prefixes, suffixes, and yuds and vavs often are not part of the root. So if you want to find the root, it's the resh, the gimel, and the lamed. Regel. A regel is actually your foot or your leg. It's the thing you use to walk. So if you're walking about in a regular fashion, just kind of, ordinary walking, that is related to the Hebrew word for to accustom oneself or to become regular. And there's a nice little, uh, totally just a pun. It's not actually, to my knowledge, it's not etymologically derived, but just think of the word regular and regel, which has a similar, the very assonant words. And you can remember the meaning of margilin, to make something regular. So if you are in the custom of playing around, either in an innocent way or a more, sexual way, this might make it regular for you le'erva, and that's a big naughty word in the Torah. There's a whole chapter of the book of Leviticus devoted to erva. Erva is the word that usually in the King Jamesian translation of the Bible is translated as nakedness. The nakedness of thy father thou shalt not uncover. Usually the again the King Jamesian phrasing for sexual immorality is to uncover one's nakedness, or ligalot erva. But erva is a category of infraction in the Jewish legal or the biblical legal tradition, specifically related to any number of boundaries that are crossed in the sexual domain. So, chiefly, restricted relationships, restricted by proximity of one person to another by family relation. So, in other words, parents, children, siblings, grandparents, parents-in-law or children-in-law, step-parents or step-children, aunts, uncles, but not notably first, second, third, fourth cousins or any cousins once, twice, third, or fourth times removed. So in the biblical, and if you want all of the jots and tittles, then you can look at Leviticus chapter 18 and read about all of the restricted sexual relationships, again, by proximity of one person to the other in the family unit. So there are a number of categorically prohibited sexual relations, again, usually by what we would consider to be, we would call all of these forms of incest. But marrying one's first cousin, having sexual relations with one's first cousin, is not a restricted category. There are other categories of erva as well, though different words tend to be used. They kind of are adjacent in the Torah. In Leviticus 18, 19, and 20, those include male homosexual intercourse, and I'm being very precise with my terminology because being gay is not a category recognized by the Torah. The Torah does not speak in the language of sexuality as an orientation. It speaks of behavior. So it makes it clear that one should not lie with a man the way one lies with a woman. That's Leviticus 18 and also comes up in Leviticus 20. That is an offense punishable by stoning to death, but it is clearly restricted to male homosexual intercourse. Lesbianism is nowhere described in the Torah. Therefore, it is not a categorically restricted in the same way as male homosexual sex is. Anyway, there are all sorts of restrictions on various sexual relations and sexual behaviors. Incest, at least not including first cousins or more distant, is a restricted category known as erva. And it all starts with being a little bit too lighthearted and playful. So again, I think that, remember, this is let us conjecture that this is a hormonally charged audience that the rabbis are addressing, right? We are talking about adolescent boys being trained up in the way of the rabbinate by the master teachers who, these are probably not the warmest, fuzziest, loosest, most easygoing kinds of Jewish teachers here. I imagine this to be a fairly strict environment, not without humor. Right, no dancing can lead to sex. Thank you for the comment, Steve. There are all sorts of jokes where that's the punchline, right? Why but the inversion of it is like, why do the rabbis restrict having sex while standing up? Might lead to dancing. Right. So, yeah, that's the gist here. Let's read on, because I think that we should also take this opening salvo by Rabbi Akiva in the context of the full Mishnah. Masoret, that's a great word. Usually it means tradition. That's how they translate it here. So tradition, and we can talk about what exactly that means. Masoret siag la Torah. Tradition is a fence for the Torah, or to the Torah. Siag, very important word for today's study. Siag is a fence. It can mean a physical fence, by the way. Obviously, this does not mean a physical fence. This is a figurative fence. But siyag comes up in the Talmud and in the Bible. For instance, it is required to put a siyag on your property if you have a pool or a well or a pit into which somebody could haphazardly fall. A parapet, which is a special kind of siyag, is mandated by, I think it's the book of Deuteronomy, for one's roof. You are biblically required to put a parapet or a siyag, a fence, on your roof for the same reason, so that somebody will not haphazardly fall off and die or injure oneself. So here, Masoret, tradition, is a fence for the Torah. We'll read all of this and unpack it afterward. Ma'asrot, a lovely another assonant word, though not, again, grammatically related to Masoret. It just happens to sound nice together. Masoret means tradition. Ma'asrot, and the reason I can tell you it's not grammatically related is, you notice Masoret is spelled with a samech, this letter here, whereas Ma'asrot is spelled with the sin. That means it sounds the same, but it's not. They're not related. Ma'asrot comes from the Hebrew root eser, ayin, sin, resh, which means 10, as in the number 10. So ma'asrot are tithes, 10th portions, enforced giving. Ma'asrot, tithes, are a siyag la'osher, are a fence for wealth. Oopsie, sorry. We'll come back to that. What does that mean, that tithes are a fence for wealth? Nidarim, vows, V-O-W-S, vows, are a siyag la prishut. Vows are a fence for abstinence, withholding, from anything, by the way. That could be abstinence from anything that from which one derives pleasure. It could be food, it could be wine, it could be sex, it could be other forms of creature comfort or pleasure giving. We can talk about that, but the point is, each one of these proposes that there is something that is a fence for something else. So vows provide a fence for abstinence, and inverting the grammar here, inverting the syntax, siyag l'chokhmah shetika, a phrase that I happen to love and which I should heed more often. A fence for wisdom is silence. Okay, Mara, you have a hand up. Would you kindly comment here? Just unmute yourself, please.
I'm just confused about the use of the word fence to connect things as opposed to a fence that would usually separate things.
Aha! Excellent, excellent, excellent. I've studied the Talmud extensively on the subject of fences of all things because the Talmud actually expatiates on the subject of fences and walls and boundaries at quite some length, which actually makes sense if you understand Judaism's long and deep preoccupation with boundaries, right? And the fence is a boundary made very physical. So fences, it is clear if you understand kind of the breadth and the depth of Jewish law, fences function in the domain of, well, designating domain, both as connectors and as dividers. We usually think that the purpose of a fence is to keep something else out, right? That the purpose of a fence is actually to designate what is in and what is out. But a fence, just as much, by my having just said so, also denotes what is in. And so a fence defines a relationship between two things that are adjacent, both by separation, but also denotes what is within. The fence actually establishes the relationship between two things. So a fence can, in fact, serve to connect in as much as a fence proposes a relationship between two things that might not have any relationship other than that they are adjacent in physical space. And in this case, there is no pre-existing relationship between X and Y until they are metaphorized, analogized into a relationship through the use of a fence. I understand that I'm probably speaking in a way that's a little bit wonky here, so maybe we should unpack it a little bit further. But let me just say that there is no pre-existing relationship between, let's take the one in the middle here because it intrigues me, between tithing and wealth until the word fence is introduced into the construct, right? Now, you can say, well, they both have to do with money. Fair enough. Tithing is giving away your money. Wealth is a function of the accumulation of money. The rabbis now propose that those two things are in relationship to one another. Somehow, tithing and wealth are connected, and the image that they propose for connecting the two, the conjunctive word, is a fence, which again, we think as separating. I'm proposing, Mara, that your comment is wonderful in that it helps us understand that it's actually not only that fences divide, but also that fences have a conjunctive function. Conjunction, junction, what's your function, right? Wasn't that, yeah, okay. Russell, why don't you chime in here because you probably have the legal mind and awareness to help us unpack this yet further.
I don't know about that, but you anticipated my question as to whether these fences are meant to keep out or to keep in. And I think it means both of them in each of these cases. For example, tithing is a fence for wealth. You could say that tithing prevents the wealth from dissipating, and therefore it is meant to keep it in. On the other hand, you could say that tithing is what invites you to discover your true wealth, which is not necessarily the accumulation of money, but rather the accumulation of public or charitable acts. And as for silence, when you say this is something we all could learn, is it saying that if you keep the noise out, the wisdom can grow in you? Or does it mean that if you restrain yourself from speaking, in other words, if you prevent the sound from going out, that you can discover the wisdom within yourself? It seems to me that the fence can be interpreted both ways in each of these cases. And it reminds me of your observation, Rabbi, that when God created the world, he did it by making divisions, by separating things, God may not necessarily have built walls, but figuratively speaking, separating light from darkness.
Yeah, the
Um,
verb to separate or to divide, lihavdil, is one of the most frequently deployed verbs in the first chapter of Genesis, in precisely the way you have referenced. And yes, this is something I've observed and taught publicly many times, that the creation, the first 7 days of creation, is very much creation by division. It's not just an act of addition. Oh, we're going to take nothing and add to it. It's actually, we're going to take disorder and divide it with clear boundaries so that it makes sense. And that's a very different kind of spiritual math, right? All of a sudden, there is light and darkness, and God divided between the light and the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. I mean, there's this a deep, almost mathematical order to the way in which creation is presented in Genesis 1, which comes about by way of fences, acts of
but
division.
it seems to me consistent with that, to say that by making these divisions in our own life, by treating this not as the obvious keeping out in, but also as keeping out, in each case, we are invited to replicate the acts of creation.
Lovely.
And by the way, I apologize to everyone in advance, but at 11 o'clock, I'm going to have to divide my work life from my study life, and I apologize in advance.
Not at all. Where are you today? Background?
Oh, this is at the Chihuly Museum in Seattle.
Oh, it's lovely and very Chihuly-esque. Thank you, Russell. I'm gonna tee up my dad only because I know that you and Mom are going to a funeral for a dear family friend in a few moments. So chime in, please.
Well, you don't have on the screen Akiva's sort of admonitions, but it seems very apt to be talking to a bunch of adolescent boys. He's kind of telling them, if you're going to be a rabbi, here's what your life is going to be like. It's going to be one of chastity, obedience to Torah, poverty, and you're going to be asked to shut up a lot more than you're going to be asked to comment.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, this is there's a strictness that is inculcated, and again, imagine a group of horny teenage boys. So,
Exactly.
Steve Maskett.
I've always thought of the fences as a protection, and like a moat would keep you from transgressing that which you're protecting. But today it feels to me like these fences are almost like a fulcrum, that the one balances the other to make it better.
Lovely. So with that in mind, with these excellent perceptive comments in mind, I'm going to bring on screen a complementary passage from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Ta'anit, which is actually about fasting, the act of fasting, ritual fasting, for penitence or propitiation. And this further explores the relationship between tithing and wealth, noting the pun between the two words, even though I said, well, let's take a look at it. It says, aser te'aser, which is literally, thou shalt make a tithe, or hyper literally, a tithe you shall tithe. Because as in English, the word tithe is both verb and noun in Hebrew, right? A tithe you shall tithe. To tithe means to take a 10th portion and donate it. A tithe is the 10th portion, the 1/10 portion that is donated. So aser to aser from Deuteronomy. You shall in fact make a tithe, or a tithe you shall tithe. And then it says aser bishvil tit asher. Do you see how the little vocal point has moved from the sin left to the shin right? If you're Hebrew proficient, then this should be familiar. If not, then just bear with me. This little dot here, this fellow, he moved. See over here, he's on this side of the sin. Now he has moved over to this side and become a shin. It just changes the vocalization. It's the same letter. It's the same consonant, just pronounced slightly differently because of the emphatic point. So it is making a pun between the word aser, which is to tithe or a tithe, and asher, ayin shin resh, which means wealth. Okay, this phrase can be interpreted homiletically. Take a tithe, aser, so that you will become wealthy, tit asher. That is to say, in the merit of the mitzvah. That's a gloss by the translator here. That by doing the mitzvah, that is a guarantee of wealth. And again, one can ask the question, well, what do we mean? Do we mean material wealth or do we mean spiritual wealth? And the answer is up to you. And then there's an anecdote to support this understanding. Rabbi Yochanan found the young son of Reish Lakish. So he just found in the sense of he encountered him. He said to the boy, recite to me your verse, that is, the verse you studied today in school. The boy said to him, aser to aser. So this line from the book of Deuteronomy, a tithe you shall tithe. The boy further said to Rabbi Yochanan, but what is the meaning of this phrase, a tithe you shall tithe? So you've got this little kid, he's probably 4 or 5 years old, and he's memorized a verse of Torah like you do, but he doesn't understand it. He says, what do we mean, a tithe you shall tithe? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, the verse means, take a tithe so that you will become wealthy. The boy said to Rabbi Yochanan, from where do you derive that this is so? In other words, how do I know? Like, where do you get this idea that if I tithe tit asher, right, I will become wealthy with the little vocal point floating from the left to the right? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I love this. So, Amar le minalach, Amar le zil nasi. This is Aramaic, which means, well, go and try it for yourself. Which I love. Like, there's no real promise here. He's like, well, how else are you going to know what will happen unless you do it? So there is the sense that tithing, doing the mitzvah of giving tzedakah in this regulated way, is a kind of guarantee for wealth. Whether that means personal wealth or satisfaction, one will never know. But I think the idea is we should habituate our children to giving tzedakah at a very young age. And the incentive is, oh, this is what will make you wealthy. But again, it's never stipulated whether they mean materially or spiritually. So now back to fences. Now, with all of this, how can we now understand the relationship between the two things that are being connected through the use of the word fence? Because they are brought into a certain relationship, and it's not only one that seems to divide. I wouldn't even say that dividing seems to be the main function of a fence here. This is not really about separating one from the other, but rather, as Mara, I think, insightfully proposed, it's connecting them. So how is tradition a fence to the Torah? What do we mean by that? Tithes are a fence to wealth. We've explored that a little bit. Vows a fence to abstinence, and silence a fence to wisdom. What is really meant here? I'm going to tell you, yeah, Steve, go for it.
So it seems to me that they are a pathway to understanding.
Okay, in some cases, a pathway to understanding. Certainly in the case of tithing, a pathway to wealth. Silence, especially, may be a pathway to understanding that by guarding one's tongue, by fencing off oneself from speech, one is being held in quietude with one's own thoughts. And
or listening.
Right. Let me tell you a little story that further illuminates the first one. It's a joke. It's an old joke. Most of you have heard it because most of you have heard me tell it, and I'm sorry. But the joke is told that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and accepted the 10 Commandments, Moses reviewed the words on the tablets and said, okay, I think I get it. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. All sounds good. Hey, what's this business about thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk? And God says, it is as I have written, Moses, thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, okay, I think I understand. So what you're saying is that you want us to eat dairy and meat separately, not together. And God says, Moses, listen to me. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. Moses thinks about it for a minute and says, okay, your lordship, I think I'm with you. So if I'm going to have milk in my house and meat. I need to get a separate set of dishes for the dairy food and then one for the meat. And God says, Moses, listen to me. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, I'm trying. I think I get it. So when I have a steak for dinner, you want me to wait 6 hours and God finally says, do whatever the hell you want, Moses. Okay, so this is the classic joke that is intended to illustrate tradition as a fence to the Torah. Typically, rabbinic law, or what is sometimes called the oral Torah. Now I'm taking us all the way back to Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. The oral law, the idea that not only do we refer to Torah as the written word of God or the spoken word of God to Moses at Sinai, but also that all of the interpretive corpus of law and Jewish teaching was also somehow communicated at Sinai, but has been flowing out from the Godhead through the sages down the generations of Jewish people and Jewish tradition, right? So that's the oral law, or the tradition. The Masoret is the Hebrew word that we're using in this week's Mishnah, right? Masoret siag la Torah. Tradition is a fence to the Torah. So this idea that we have this accumulated Jewish wisdom, also known collectively as Torah, the wisdom of all of the sages across all of the ages, is Torah writ large, Torah with the biggest capital T. All of that stuff in the oral law is designed as a fence for the actual Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the written Torah, the strict, narrowest word of God, so that one will not violate any of the precepts of Torah. So yes, it is true, the Torah says, thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk. But over the years of accumulated Jewish teaching and tradition, using the word from this Mishnah, it becomes increasingly difficult to violate the original precept because you've built up an architecture that makes it harder to violate the precept, right? So you will never seethe a kid in its mother's milk if you separate the eating of milk and meat by your dishware, by the number of hours between milk meals and meat meals, by all of your utensils, by the fact that you're keeping a kosher kitchen. It becomes harder and harder and harder to violate the prime directive, which is thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk, right? If you can't even have, forget a cheeseburger, if you can't have an ice cream cone a half hour after you have a steak dinner, how much the more so are you unlikely to violate the primary directive, which is don't take a goat and boil it in the very milk of its mother. Now are you following how tradition is a fence to the Torah? That's usually how the word fence is used in this context. It is a boundary that makes it even harder to violate the primary directive. Though, in the case of tithing, it is an enforced practice that actually provides a condition that makes in this case wealth possible. So I'm not saying that I wanted to tackle the one about tradition being a fence to the Torah, because it does propose a certain relationship between possibly the oral law and the written law, where one is a very big high wall, and then there's the lower wall, and the first one makes it harder to violate the inner one. Or the second one makes it harder to violate the first one. Steve, is your hand still up from before, or is this a new hand?
Well, it's up from before, but what you're saying suggests that the fence in the first phrase is somewhat different from the fence in the other phrases, and I'm trying to find a way that they're the same.
Yeah, indeed. It is probably the case that one protects the other, right? If you either do or do not do A, then B is easier to do or do not do. It seems to me that the positive or negative, whether this is a positive commandment like tithing, or a negative commandment like thou shalt not eat milk and meat together, thou shalt not see the kid in its mother's milk, the point is that there is an enforced practice that makes it either easier to fulfill the first or harder to fulfill the first. If you hold your silence, you will more likely accumulate wisdom. And again, that's why the first frame is really relevant here. Merriment and frivolity accustom one to sexual licentiousness. So just flip that and use the word fence to describe the same basic teaching, and you would say, let's say, sobriety is a fence for chastity. Do you understand how I did that? I flipped the phrase and I used the word fence to connote the very same point. That yes, if we are concerned that if you start out with a day that begins with games and play, either of the child sort or of the grown-up sort, it will lead you down a path that will cause you to violate a core precept of the Torah. Therefore, the fence around chastity is cultivating a sober bearing. Do not spend too much of your time making merry or engaging in frivolous activity, because the next thing you know, you'll be dancing. The next thing you know, you'll be fornicating in restricted ways. Okay. Any other comments or thoughts on fences before we move on? Excellent. Let's move on. So our next text is also ascribed to Akiva. And I just love this one. This is a very long Mishnah. So we're going to read it in English first and then maybe unpack a bit of the Hebrew. He, meaning Akiva, used to say, "Beloved," forgive the gender insensitive framing here. I'll substitute the word humanity. "Beloved is humankind, for humanity was created in the image of God. Especially beloved is humankind, for it was made known to humanity that they have been created in the image of God. For it is said, or as it is said, for in the image of God did God make humankind." Genesis 9:6. That's the first premise. So, and all of these follow the same twofold format. So we're going to see in the Hebrew, Hu haya omer, phrase that we should know by now. He used to say, Akiva used to say, Chaviv, Chaviv is a word that means beloved. Adam is a person, not just a male, but a person. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tselem. A person is beloved because one is created b'tselem, literally in the image, or under the shadow. Tselem is a wonderful word, but it means image. In the image of the divine is what's implied. Chibayetera, even more beloved, noda'at lo shenivra v'tselem, that it was made known to humankind that we were made in the divine image. So, one, the fact that we are made in God's image is a sign of God's love for humanity. The fact that God made it known to us that we were made, that we were told. We didn't have to figure this out. All you have to do is read the Torah. Shene Emar, as it says in Genesis chapter 9, Ki b'tselem Elohim asa et ha'adam. For in the image of God did God make humankind. So not only is it a sign of God's love for us that we are made in the divine image, but even more so that God let us know that we were made in the divine image. Next text, and you're going to see these are all, it's a recursive text. It follows a repeating framework. Beloved are Israel, not the country. Israel is always in the Mishnaic Hebrew a stand-in for what we would call Jew or Jews or the Jewish people. Beloved is the Jewish people in that we were called children to the all-present. And this is playing off of, as you can say, Chavivin Yisrael, right here, Chavivin Yisrael, Sheniikru Vanim Lamakom. We talked a lot last week about the word makom, or 2 weeks ago, the word that literally means a place, but that when applied in certain contexts means the omnipresent one, the one who is every place and is in every place, that is to say, the divine. So, beloved is the Jewish people that we were identified as banim, from ben, a child, lamakom, to the one who is omnipresent. Chibayetera noda lahem shenikru vanim lamakom. And especially beloved are we, Jewish people, For it was made known to us that we are called children of the all-present. And how do we know that? Because the proof text is Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1. As it is said, you are children to the Lord your God, to the eternal your God. The third teaching, still recursive, beloved are Israel, that is to say the Jewish people, in that a precious vessel was given to them. We'll talk about that precious vessel, but just so you get the Hebrew, so it says, Chavivin Yisrael shenitan lahem kli chemda. Kli chemda. Kli is a utensil, or a tool, or a vessel. It can mean a jug, but it can also mean a hand tool, any instrument. So I would say a cherished instrument, a beloved tool, a special vessel was given to them, meaning the Jewish people. And especially beloved are they, for it was made known to them that the desirable instrument with which the world had been created. So what instrument are we talking about? Was given to them, as it is said, for I give you good instruction, forsake not my teaching. This phrase here from the book of Proverbs, Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al ta'azovu. You may not know that phrase, but it is in the prayer book. Every time we take the Torah out of the ark, we say Ki lekach tov, or every time we put the Torah away, we say Ki lekach tov natati lachem torati al ta'azovu, and the very next line is Eitz chayim hi lama chazikim ba. So this is the preamble or the preface to it is a tree of life to those who hold it fast, and all who cling to it find happiness. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. Also from the book of Proverbs. It's, I think, sequential in chapter 4 of the book of Proverbs, but we need to look it up in my Tanakh. So 3 recursive phrases to review. Beloved is humankind, for we were created in the image of God. Especially beloved is humankind, for it was made known to us that we were created in the image of God. And then the proof text, for in the image of God did God make humankind. Beloved is the Jewish people, in that we were called children to the all-present. Especially beloved are we, for it was made known to us that we are called children of the all-present. As it is said, you are children. Banim atem ladonai Elohechem. You are children to Adonai your God. Beloved is the Jewish people, in that a precious vessel was given to us. Especially beloved are we, for it was made known to us that the desirable instrument with which the world had been created was given to us, as it is said, for I have given you good instruction, forsake not my teaching. So, first of all, what is the cherished vessel? And secondly, what does this text mean, and what does it mean to you, Michelle?
All I can answer is that it's Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Beyond that,
Great.
Big 12.
Great.
I
Yeah, so the
can't answer
cherished
your-
vessel is Torah, and it is especially important to know that in the rabbinic mindset, Torah was not only the gift of God to the Jewish people
Blueprint
as
for
a
the-
demonstration of God's love, but also the blueprint for God's creation of the world.
Mhm.
And you have to really take that literally, because what does that mean? It's not like when we read the 5 books of Moses, we can see instructions for how to build a world. That's not really what is meant here. It's a metaphor. The idea is that the Torah contains within it all divine wisdom. It is, as it were, the DNA of the creation. It's encoded, right? So everything you need to know about God's design for the world, God's intentions for the world, God's intention for humankind in relationship to God and the world, and especially God's intentions for the relationship between the Jewish people and God, and between the Jewish people and the world, is encoded like DNA strands in the Torah. Therefore, the Torah is likened to a blueprint with which God created the creation. Knowing that, and knowing the meaning of the verse that is used here, Ki lekach tov, for I have given you a good portion, or a good inheritance, Torati al ta'azovu, my instruction, my Torah, do not forsake it. Eitz chayim hi lamachazikim ba, it is a tree, it is a living tree for those who grasp it tightly. All who cling to it find happiness. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. That's the full text that is being alluded to here. So it's clear that each one of these follows the same frame, right? Beloved is humankind, especially beloved that we know we were chosen, or that we know that we are beloved. Beloved is the Jewish people, especially beloved that we know we are beloved. Beloved especially are the Jewish people because of the Torah that was given to us. Especially beloved are we because of the Torah that was given to us, because we know it was given to us as a sign of God's love.
Mhm.
That's the threefold architecture of the Mishnah we've just read. Make sense? So now your thoughts or questions, because this really does open up a conversation about, well, how do we understand the notion of God's love for the Jewish people, of the chosenness of the Jewish people, which is expressly articulated in this Mishnah. Steve, why don't you take the lead here?
So, I mean, this mission is fascinating. It goes from the universal to the particular. In the first being Adam, as opposed to Israel. And I was wondering about why there would be two phrases about Israel. The first, being a child of God, seems, and I was thinking about the fact that being a child requires honoring, and being given the Torah requires action of some kind.
Beautiful. I want to pause you there because I think you're unpacking one of the most rich dimensions of this Mishnah. Because so this is one of the clearest statements in all of rabbinic literature about what we would call the chosenness of the Jewish people. Though I want to make it clear the word chosen is actually not used in this text. However, inasmuch as the chosenness of the Jewish people among all of humanity is doctrinal within Judaism, which I believe it is, despite the discomfort that it has prompted in some, maybe in the congregation today, meaning the 20 or so of us who are studying together, there's some discomfort around the doctrine of Jewish chosenness. Certainly, exponents of far greater stature than any of us, like Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, took strong issue with the doctrine of Jewish chosenness, which is why Kaplan, and especially his followers who would develop what is today understood to be Reconstructionist Judaism, which is based on the teachings and the premises of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, would say that Jewish chosenness is actually a form of chauvinism by the Jewish people that ought to be extirpated, removed from the tradition. And that's why if you go to a Reconstructionist Shabbat service and listen to the Torah blessings in translation, or just listen to them and you know some Hebrew, you will see that they've actually changed the language of the Torah blessing, which is the most famous and prominent declaration of Jewish chosenness in the liturgy, right? Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarach, after that part. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. Literally, you have chosen us from all peoples. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim means, God, you have chosen us from among all peoples. V'natan lanu et Torato. But notice how it is adjacent to, and therefore in conjunction with, by meaning, not just by proximity. V'natan lanu et Torato, and has given us the Torah. So chosenness and giving the Torah are related in the Jewish imagination. In the Torah blessing is the most prominent example, and I use it because I'm assuming it's broadly familiar, even if you've never really thought about the words you're saying when you when you have an aliyah to the Torah and you chant the blessings. Asher bachar banu et kol hamim, mikol hamim, who has chosen us from among all peoples, v'natan lanu et Torato, and has given us the Torah. Is it merely two separate things? You chose us and you gave us the Torah? Or is it, as I believe, you chose us by virtue of giving us the Torah? And what's fascinating about what Steve is observing here is that there are really two kinds of chosenness being described. There's the chosenness of one being like a child to the parent, in which the child has no actual volition in the matter, right? I mean, yes, at some point, I guess children can, in a way, choose whether or not to be or to remain the children of their parent or parents. But that's not really what I mean. Generally, to be a child is a relationship imposed unilaterally by the parent, by giving birth or adopting or taking one under one's bosom as a child. In other words, and there's no condition placed on it. You are my children. That's it. I love you. I'm here to care for you. I'm God. You're my children. Whereas, and I think Steve is alluding to this, or you said it outright, the relationship of beloved or chosenness denoted by the giving of Torah requires that we are actually doing something with this heritage. As it says in the proof text, Torati al ta'azovu, this is my instruction, do not forsake it. There's something we have to do to uphold the relationship of chosenness. That is a different kind of covenant, right? That is a bilateral covenant, not just the unilateral covenant of being a chosen child, but being a recipient of Torah as a sign of God's love for us requires faithfulness to the Torah, responsiveness to the Torah in reciprocal action. Michelle.
So I guess three things. First of all, Kaplan also changed the Aleinu, which is probably the two places you see it
That's
most
the other
in
one.
the regular
Correct.
service. And in fact, our prayer book has 4 different versions. So you get to pick and choose whether you want that text or not.
And the reason the Reform Siddur has different versions of Aleinu is exactly out of the recognition that for some people, including some of the rabbis who wrote the Reform prayer book, which is also anthologized over much time. Like the current Reform prayer book contains Mishkan Tefillah, the one we use at WRT, contains vestiges of a prayer book that is 130 years older than Mishkan Tefillah. Particularly David Einhorn's book Olat Tamid, which was the template for the old Union prayer book, which was itself the template for the new Union prayer book, which was the template for Mishkan Tefillah. So when you read lines that are as familiar to us as Shema Yisrael in the Reform movement, for instance, may the time not be distant, O God, when your name shall be, that one that we read before Aleinu, that's old. Grant us peace, that thy most precious gift, O eternal source of peace, and give us the will to bring its message to all the peoples of the earth. Bless our country as a stronghold of peace, its advocate among the nations. All of these are old things that just keep getting recycled and slightly updated linguistically. So yes, Aleinu is the other signature declaration of Jewish chosenness. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. It is up to us to give praise to the master of all. Latet gedula liotzer bereshit, to give greatness or to exalt the maker of all creation. Shelo asanu kigoye ha'aratzot, who has not made us like the other nations of the earth. Velo samanu kamishpachot adama, and has not stationed our lot or not allotted our portion like all the other families of the earth. Shelo sam chalkenu kahem, I'm trying to do this from memory, who has not made our portion like theirs. Vigoralenu kachol hamonam, nor is our destiny to be like that of all of the masses. It is definitive. I would say Aleinu, perhaps even more than the Torah blessing, Michelle, is the definitive statement of Jewish chosenness. Thank you for raising it. Go on, please.
Okay, 2 other things. Second, I have paper, which I'm not going to try to, it's a whole study on its own, that attempts to use Talmudic text, that is, get inside the Talmudic imagination and thought processes to explain how Torah existed before the beginning of the world, even though they know it was given afterwards, and therefore became the template and the basis, the foundation for God's creation. And it's really interesting, but there is a timeless, I would say circularity, but maybe a timelessness that is attributed to this, that is reflected here in what we're talking about.
Indeed.
Because of the way. So and which is also why you can pick any text in the Torah and use them as proof texts interchangeably, even though the Tanakh appears to have a time run on.
Right.
A timeline.
Yeah. The phrase
it really
in Hebrew,
doesn't.
The
Right.
phrase in Hebrew, which may be familiar to you, is Ein mukdam ve'ein meuchar b'Torah. At least in the rabbinic imagination, Ein mukdam means there is no before or there is no early. Ve'ein meuchar, which means there is no late in the Torah. In other words, the Torah can be quoted selectively and without regard to its internal chronology in terms of substantiating any point of Jewish practice or law.
And then my
So you
third,
can make the case that Abraham was as bound by the rules of the Torah as anyone else. But when the rabbis want to, by the way, they make exemptions on that front. Share your other point,
okay.
and then I'll get
And-
Arlene.
Yeah, apologies. This is really where I wanted to go on this. As we in Torah study go through it year after year after year and keep reading the same texts again and again, one of the things that I've come to observe is that I see Torah as a story of an increasing narrowness of interest. So we start with Tohu Vavohu, which is just this thing, and then God creates an earth. So there's a thing. And then the next thing, we're out of paradise. And so there's a smaller group, because there's also the people to the east. So there's a separation. And then Noah, God gives up. There's a series of gives up, starts over with Noah's family. Then we get to Babel, and there's only a smaller group. And then by the time we get to Abraham, God is essentially trying and trying and trying. There's a series of multiple creations. None of them quite take, perhaps. And so finally we come down to Abraham. By this point, God says, okay, I'm not going to. Oh, and then when we come to Egypt, in some sense, after 400 years, God starts again. Okay, now I'm going to write it down for you. Yeah. And so there's an increasing narrowness to this, which creates this ultimately Jewish people who has culled or focused on from this broader everything base. And to me, this is interesting, fascinatingly different, completely opposed to what we see in Christianity and Islam, and perhaps other feelings that purport to claim this is the right way for the entire world.
That's really a really interesting observation. I hadn't made the leap to the comparative part of your comment myself, so thank you for that. Meaning the last part where you say, if you look at how Christianity and Islam are formulated in their sacred literature, it actually starts with the very, very small, and the lens zooms out to encompass all of humanity and all of creation, which can be redeemed or saved through the saving power of the Christ. Whereas in Judaism, the opening frame is very, very wide lens, encompassing all of creation, and it keeps getting narrower and narrower and narrower till it's really about the relationship between the individual Jew and God, or maybe the priest and God, depending on where you are in the latter half of the Torah. It does zoom out again so that the Torah and the Tanakh becomes, ultimately, it is the story of the relationship between the Jewish people and God, and between the Jewish people and the world. But the focus is very clearly on this civilization, this group of people. Whereas I think you're quite correct that the ultimate aims, and this follows the flow of the literature, the sacred literature of both the Christian scriptures and the Quran, the ultimate aim is actually to start with this narrow lens of the prophet or the chief figure, Jesus in the Christian scripture, Muhammad in the Quran, and then to extrapolate out not just for one people, the small band of followers, or there's no real sense of ethnic similarity, that's not emphasized anyway in the other monotheistic faiths, and to move outward to the great proposal of the Christian literature and the Islamic literature is that this is God's master plan for the salvation of all humankind. Lovely, lovely observation, Michelle. Thank you for teaching us. Arlene, you're next.
Well,
and then Deborah Moody
Jonathan,
is after you.
okay. Jonathan, you just said it for me. When I think of the Torah and when I read the Bible, I see it as a historical document that is supposed to be convincing people of the necessity of start to believe in a monotheistic situation as opposed to what historically what was going on before. And I think when I hear the word chosen, I don't hear it as we're a special people, but we've been chosen to start to go down a different path that was not historically popular at the time that the Bible supposedly came to be.
Right, and thank you for that. And that's why I think that in this text for Akiva, the relationship between God and humanity, or between God and the Jewish people as parent to child, is a necessary but insufficient condition of the relationship between the divine and the Jewish people. And what is required is Torah, right? This text really cannot be understood and remains incomplete without that essential third component, which is what, and you could say, well, why are we still talking about the Jewish people? We've already established that God has a special relationship with the Jewish people, and in the formula that is deployed throughout this Mishnah, and that they are especially beloved because God let us know that we are beloved. In other words, we don't have to figure it out on our own. We don't have to spend our lives casting about in the darkness, wondering, does God love me? For the Jew, to read the Torah is to understand that God loves us. But even more than that, we have to actually take the cherished vessel and be in relationship with Torah in order to fulfill the mandate of our chosenness. So that's why I much prefer that we understand chosenness as we are not merely the chosen people, we are the people who must keep choosing.
Okay.
Deb Moody,
All right.
great, Arlene, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I think what you sort of already said better what I was going to say. The thing that I find comforting about this three-part thing that we looked at is, don't forget that the first part is that God loves all humanity. That's the first message there, is that God created humanity in his image, and that is his sign of, that's God's sign of love. The issues of sort of elitist or chauvinistic view of the Jewish people that have always troubled me, like when I read it in this context, I understand it in a more comfortable way for myself, which is that kind of touches on what you said, that we're not chosen because because we are already something so special. We are chosen because now we have more obligation than everybody else. The chosenness is, I am giving you this task because I think you're up to it, which is to benefit all of humankind, not to draw down into your own insular nation or community, but I think that you are up to the task, and I'm giving you these marching orders, basically.
Yeah, quite compellingly phrased. I love that, and I want to affirm that the special relationship between the Jew and God, as denoted in this teaching by Rabbi Akiva, does not invalidate the fact that is stipulated first and foremost, which is that all human beings are made in the divine image. So another person who is not a Jew is no less a child of God, in the sense of child meaning made in the image of the divine.
Right.
Lovely. Audrey, do you want to chime in here?
Yes, please. I remember in confirmation class at WRT, we were told that we were chosen to be a light unto the nations.
Beautiful.
In other words, we're to be an example of how to live a holy life, or if not holy, at least a good life, and a life consistent with the teachings of God.
Well, thank you, first of all. I know how important your upbringing and your spiritual indoctrination at the feet of Rabbi Jack Stern was to you and your family, and it's meaningful to hear it recalled here in public with this community. You've given me a lesson plan for next week with my confirmation class, so thank you. I wasn't able to make last night's class just because of a medical emergency that I had to attend to. But I've been thinking about, well, what do I really want? My class is called How to Be a Good Jew, in quotes, in a Complex World. That's my curriculum this year. I change up my curriculum every year, but there are some lessons that I keep coming back to. But this would make for an outstanding discussion with our kids to start with the idea of Jewish chosenness and just let the kids duke it out for a while, because it is such a provocative comment. And our kids are so wonderfully, by the way, kids today in this community are so wonderfully universalistic in their outlook, and they are suspicious of particularism. And Jewish particularism included, though some of that is a luxury that they have growing up as a basic Jewish majority in one of the few communities in the country where one can be a Jewish majority. And until they go off to college, even if they go to like Muhlenberg or Penn or Michigan, where they will be 30% of the population is Jewish, right? They'll still feel it. They'll feel that they've gone from being a majority to being a minority. And they might put a different premium on their particular relationship with Judaism. Nevertheless, as my assumption is that most kids these days are universalists, and they really want to lean into the first part of Akiva's statement, that all are made in the image of God, which, by the way, is a core premise of Black Lives Matter, and that's a cause that I think many of our kids, especially after George Floyd's murder, really feel allied and aligned with. What's harder for kids is what makes Jews special. What do we mean that we are proud of being Zionists? These are really hard issues, and they're the kinds of topics that I'm wrestling with my 10th graders. I have to say, we have an outstanding 10th grade class this year. We do almost every year, but this is the largest group we've had in over 6 years. I spent almost all of last weekend with our confirmation class. We did not take a retreat as we do every single year, only because Eisner Camp, our usual retreat facility, is not yet hosting groups. So we did a confirmation staycation, but we were with our kids from Friday at 3 p.m. until Sunday at 1 p.m. They slept at home, of course, but we were really with them for 3 consecutive days. We had a fantastic weekend, and I'm looking forward to next week's class when I can honor what Audrey has shared with us in the name of Rabbi Jack Stern. So thank you. Beautiful. Let's do one more Mishnah, and then I'll conclude the class on the earlier side today, with gratitude for your understanding. And Michelle, your comment about SJ is great. Both that, a light under the nations can also sound pretty chutzpahdik and arrogant, and it just depends on how you understand what that means. It doesn't just mean that you get to bask in the light. You got to be the light. There's work. Being a Jew is not for the faint of heart. And then my daughter says she felt more Jewish at college with single-digit Jewish community than ever before in Scarsdale, and that's after 12 years at WRT. And I think that's not uncommon, right? Especially for kids who go to some of the smaller liberal arts schools where they will not be a 30% minority or plurality. Okay, so looking at one more Mishnah, it's a short one, but boy, is it complicated. So, and I don't have an answer to it. You're going to help me. Let's do it in English first and then Hebrew. Everything is foreseen. Also, this is an unattributed Mishnah. So we don't know who it belongs to, but some say also Akiva. Since we're already in the frame of Akiva, and since there's no other attribution given, sometimes you will see this quote attributed to Akiva. But technically, the answer is we don't know who said it. It's just the anonymous voice of the Mishnah or Pirkei Avot speaking to us. Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted. And these conjunctions are really tricky because the conjunctions are very loose in Hebrew, and you can translate them in multiple ways, all of which are accurate. And the world is judged with goodness, and everything is in accordance with the preponderance of works. This one is almost like a Zen koan in its embrace of the mysterious and the cryptic. Let's do the Hebrew and I'll render it differently. Hakol tzafui. That's actually pretty good. Everything, hakol tzafui, is foreseen. Tzafui from a word that means to look. Everything is foreseen. Vehareshut nituna. And it doesn't have to mean yet. It could be, however, more disjunctive. We just don't know. Everything is foreseen, and literally permission or volition is granted. So everything is foreseen and volition is granted. Human volition, human action. Uvetov ha'olam nidon. Literally, and in the good, you know the word tov. Uvetov, and in the good, or with the good, is the world judged. Moving on from there, vihakol, and everything, same word that began the Mishnah, everything lefi rov hamaaseh, and everything is according to the preponderance of deeds. And that probably is directly connected to the phrase that immediately precedes it. So the period is misleading here. I think we could just say uvetov ha'olam nidon, and with good is the world judged, everything according to the preponderance of works. So this is very much about the interplay, yet again, between humanity and God. This is not specifically Jewish, but it seems to flow logically from the previous text in that it wants to explore the dynamic that is animated in the human-divine relationship. And it wants to make clear that our actions and our choices matter. And if we're moving from chosenness to choice, I think that this text would give us the permission to do exactly that, right? We wanted to move from chosenness to choice because I think that our own Jewish sensibilities lead us there. But here's a text that actually suggests that action is the decisive factor in our relationship with God. It is how we spend our lives that really matters. And yet, we don't want to do this in a way that somehow would invalidate God's omniscience. Audrey, your thoughts here. Very, very complex text. So this is just a time for open reflection by way of concluding our lesson this morning. Oh, unmute yourself kindly. Thank you.
This is my greatest problem altogether, not
Good.
just with Judaism, but with everything, because it's a question of free will.
Indeed.
And I
This
wanted
is the
to,
classic Jewish text about fate versus free will, by the way. I mean, I didn't use those words to set it up because I figured you would all identify that. But Audrey, go on.
I wanted to write a senior independent work on this in college, but it got rejected. I guess it didn't fit with my economics major, but in any case.
You were always a philosopher, even though you majored in economics.
Right. But I just, I find this very, very, very troubling. And it's getting more troubling the worse our world gets, which it is rapidly. So I don't know. I can't believe it actually said that in the Mishnah.
What specifically lodges with you in a way that provides discomfort?
Well, everything is foreseen. So everything is programmed ahead of time, but we still have free choice or free will, but we really don't. And if so, and why people say that God didn't create the Holocaust, for instance, men were bad and man or humankind, whatever you want to say, we did it. But
what if we were to, and I'm gonna lean into the discomfort of this because I think you're right, but I want to test some of the assumptions publicly. And Audrey, you don't have to remain in the hot seat, by the way. This can be open for anyone. So thank you. I'll even keep you muted with gratitude for your really going straight to the heart of the discomfort, which is where much great learning comes from. The other place, of course, is silence. So maybe afterward, we'll all take a few minutes. I wrote a meditation for today's e-blast on the power of meditation. I can't say enough important and good things. And in fact, tonight I'm leaving for a 3-day meditation retreat in the Catskills, and then I'll be back on Sunday morning. But I would like to explore where Audrey's going with this. What if we were to consider that the phrase "everything is foreseen" does not necessarily mean that everything, the way it happens, is in fact fated, but that every potential outcome is foreseen. Imagine a world or a universe in which time, and by the way, Einstein proposes this, time is simply the way in which human beings perceive time is simply because of our limited perspective. And that from God's perspective, as it were, or from the perspective of the infinite universe, all time is happening all the time at all times. And so that every moment that ever was, is, or will be is actually concurrent or exists. And every potential or possible outcome also therefore exists. Some people talk about multiple universes, an existence in which there are simultaneous avenues being explored. We started our morning with Robert Frost, Something There Is That Doesn't Love a Wall, and we talked about fences. We'll conclude our day by thinking about another line of Robert Frost, who said, two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And he goes on to say, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. I hope I'm getting it mostly right. It's one of the handful of poems that I have memorized, not by choosing to, it just happened. So you can't, in the human world, the world of our limited perspective, you cannot choose two roads at the same time and be one traveler, right? You can't go down two paths at the same time. But what if from God's perspective, every path is a valid and open path and is as real as the other? And that is what is meant by everything is foreseen. That, by the way, is how I choose to interpret this text, because the text is open enough to permit that interpretation. Okay, I've got some real hands up here. Sandy Edlitz, you're next. And Sandy Edlitz dropped off for some reason. I don't know why. I feel bad about that. Sandy, if you
I'm
can.
here.
Oh, hi. We hear you now. Go for it.
I lowered my hand before, just as you were
Okay.
noticing it, but I was thinking that it's very consistent with the idea and the character of God to that statement that that we are given free will, and yet the all-knowing and mighty knows how we will exercise it, yet we have it, and it's all
Right. By the way, Spinoza lives in that philosophy of basically even the things you think are your own free will actions are actually just the unfolding of God's will, that there is no free will. And that emerges from Spinoza's conjecture or premise, his main thesis, which is that everything is God. And if everything is God, if everything is the unfolding of the divine or the unfolding of the divine will, then there is no such thing as free will, even though we persist under the illusion that we are the masters of our own choice and destiny. And that is one reason I both love and hate Spinoza. Steve Maskett, your comment. Thank you for that, Sandy.
So I happen to like your interpretation of the beginning of this Mishnah, Rabbi. But I actually, there's a piece of Spinoza that makes a lot of sense to me. But what I focused on was the last phrase, measured by the preponderance of works, which suggests to me that one can stray from the good and still, by preponderance of the works, be fine. So that's where the choice occurs, and you can make mistakes, and you cannot,
Right.
and you can get there.
Yeah, this one's a lot easier, I think, for us to absorb within our Judaism and our Reform Judaism, that ours is nevertheless, whatever we may think about God's design for the universe, God's relationship with humanity, and the ultimate, flow of time, space, and existence, at the end of the day, you have choices to make about what kind of life you're going to live. So go and be a mensch. Go and do the important things, give your tzedakah, treat others with, and that's why Pirkei Avot will occasionally stray into these very vexing philosophical ruminations, but then it will quickly pull itself back to, okay, my friends, we've had a little bit of time, out there in Star Trek land, as Linda Ortner colorfully commented about the space-time continuum. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's an Einsteinian concept, that time and space are actually part of a continuum. They are not independent from one another. And you know that because if you traverse vast distances of space at very, very, very high speeds, like the speed of light, time actually changes. Time is warped in relationship to space. You get into quantum physics, and this all really will bend your brain into all sorts of different pretzel-like shapes. But at the end of the day, we can spend some time in the philosophical musing space. But the rabbis want to quickly pull us back to, okay, so what do so what's for lunch? No, not what's for lunch, but who are you going to feed for lunch today? How are you going to live? And more than that, let us not think that we are judged by the worst thing we ever did. It's the balance sheet, right? Tally up enough mitzvot, and you're probably going to be just fine in the eyes of God. So there's that lovely outer space stuff, but at the end of the day, it's much more about what kind of a life you're going to live, or at least the two are in balance with one another. Trish?
I was just about to kind of highlight that too, because there's that phrase in the middle, and the world is judged with goodness. I think we've just kind of glossed right over that.
Right.
Like,
Yeah,
don't get
God's
too-
not
don't
out
worry
to
about it too
get
much.
you here. Right.
Which, a little hard to believe, but okay.
Right, but and again, there's so much that the tradition wants to lift up about God. God is omniscient, God is omnipresent, God is omnibenevolent, meaning all good, or at least good enough that the world and your deeds will not be judged punitively, but rather with the attribute of goodness, with the assumption of goodness, perhaps. There's so much also that's ambiguous about this text, which I like because it opens us up to treating it more like a poem than as a piece of dogma. Okay, Michelle, you want to get in one more comment before we have to wrap up today?
I'm passing.
Great.
Another time. 'Cause
Great.
I know you have to leave.
So let us heed Akiva's advice and let silence be a fence for wisdom. I'm so grateful we've spent this time contemplating some of my favorite Mishnaiot in Pirkei Avot. This has been a particularly rich and vibrant discussion, but then again, I find myself thinking and saying that every single week. But maybe if we just sit with some of our learning from today over the coming days, we'll return to this virtual channel next Thursday, even more deeply enriched than we are right now. That's certainly my hope. I also want to just advise what I did in the email to the class, that we are meeting next Thursday at 10:15. We are not meeting on Veterans Day because temple activities are closed in observance of Veterans Day. We will meet again on the 18th. We will not meet on the 25th. And we keep going until the middle of December. So lots more learning to do. We'll definitely get well into chapter 4 of Pirkei Avot this semester. Maybe, who knows? We'll probably complete chapter 3 next week. Okay, my friends, be well. Bye-bye.